So let me just enlarge it so we'll get an even bigger view. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive into this. I'm just going to scroll down on my screen, and there we go. You're coming along. So let's go to paragraph 5 of the 1 to 4 family contract. We are going to see here the first critical date, deadline, and time period, and that is delivery of the earnest money. Here's what it says. Within 3 days after the effective date, buyer must deliver blank dollars as earnest money to the escrow agent. So 3 days after the effective date is once all parties have signed the contract and all parties have been informed that all parties have signed. Now there is an exception. If you look lower in this paragraph, it says if the last day to deliver the earnest money falls on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, the time to deliver the earnest money is extended until the end of the next day that's not a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. So the reason for that is the earnest money is delivered to the title company. They're not open typically Saturday, Sundays, or legal holidays, and so it extends until the next one that's not for the delivery of the earnest money. I get a lot of questions about number 2, which is the deadline for delivery of a second earnest money deposit. Look at the highlighted portion on your screen. Buyer shall deliver additional earnest money of blank amount to escrow agent within blank days after the effective date. Why in the world would we have 2 deliveries of earnest money? Sometimes it's simply that the buyer may not have all their money at the time of contract, but they're getting a bonus or a paycheck or something a week later, so they can put $1,000 down now and then a second earnest money deposit of $5,000, say next week. But more typically, this deposit would come in a situation involving a contingency addendum or something of that nature, where they're making a big deposit now and then a second one later when something else happens. So let's scroll down here to number 3. This is going to be paragraph 6B, the delivery of the title commitment. Within 20 days after the title company receives a copy of this contract, seller shall furnish to buyer a commitment of title insurance. So very importantly, almost every date in this contract triggers off the effective date. But you note here, it's not the effective date. The title company has 20 days after they receive the contract for the seller to furnish a copy to the buyer. Now, it's interesting. There are a couple things in this contract where if the deadline isn't met, there's an automatic extension of time. And this delivery of the title commitment is one of them. Look at the language here. Seller authorizes the title company to deliver the commitment and exception documents to the buyer at the address shown in Chapter 21. If the commitment and exception documents are not delivered within that specified time, the time for delivery will be automatically extended up to 15 days or 3 days before the closing date. So again, it's just automatic. Nothing has to happen to trigger that except failure to deliver the commitment. Let me just point out something. This is not technically on topic, but it's extremely important. On the vast majority of contracts that I see, the buyer and seller contact information is not completed in paragraph 21. The agent just leaves that blank, I guess out of concern that the cooperating agent will then have the contact information for your client, and you're concerned that they would reach out to them directly. But there's a reason paragraph 21 is there. You absolutely need to fill it in with at least a legal mailing address so this title commitment can be provided. But that's also the address for legal notices should somebody decide to exercise one of their rights under the contract and provide notice, or there's a lawsuit or something like that. So always provide that information in paragraph 21, your client contact information. Let's go to number 5, the deadline for the delivery of the survey and the T47 affidavit. Within blank days after the effective date of the contract, seller shall furnish to buyer and title company seller's existing survey and a T47 affidavit. So this is what you would check, C1, if the seller says they have a survey. Now, they may not have found it yet. Maybe it's in the files. Maybe they need to recover it from the title company, but they're confident they're going to be able to have one. If they don't have a survey, don't check for one. Don't check box C1. Check C2 if the buyer is going to purchase it, or C3 if the seller is going to purchase it. But all of those have time periods in which the survey is going to be furnished. Now, you'll note here again in paragraph C1, if the existing survey or affidavit is not acceptable to the title company or the buyer's lender, the buyer shall obtain a new survey, and you indicate who's going to pay for it no later than 3 days prior to closing. So this would happen if for some reason, maybe the seller said they had it, but they couldn't come up with it, or it was defective in some way, or the affidavit was not acceptable. And again, this may seem like a rabbit trail, but it's very, very important. When most sellers are completing the T47 affidavit, and often it's the agent who fills it in, you're putting in there the time period from when the seller purchased the property. But if that seller purchase date does not line up with the date on the survey, the title company will not accept it, because they want to know that no changes have been done to the property that would invalidate the survey since this survey was completed. So if the survey, say, is from 1985 and your seller's purchased in 2005, and they date the affidavit from 2005, appropriate, because that's the only time period that they can be certain of, that survey is not going to be valid. And I'm telling you that right now, so that if you know that going in, instead of, and you represent the seller, you don't want to be checking, C1. You want to inform the buyer's agent in advance that you don't have a current survey, and then you can negotiate C2 or C3 about who is going to purchase it. All right, let's keep rocking and rolling here. Look with me at D, objections. We're at number 7, objection period for defects, exceptions, or encumbrances to title. Buyer may object to the earlier of the closing date or blank days after buyer receives the commitment, exception documents, and the survey. So what can they object to? Anything that's not listed in the printed exemptions above, or anything that's not written in on the line in D. And what we're typically seeing here is if a buyer wants to have, for example, a home office, you need to write that in here, because some HOAs may prohibit that. A real hot topic right now is farmyard pets. Perhaps they want to have their chicken coop in the backyard. Again, many HOAs have issues with that. So put chickens in the backyard, or peacocks, or a goat, or whatever it is they want to do. Perhaps they want to park their RV on the property, and in many places that would be prohibited. So if your buyer has some issue that is not typical, you want to write it on this line and then put in certain number of days, 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, so that once they hear back that that activity is not permitted, they can withdraw from the contract and get their earnest money back. Number 8, the cure period for defects or exceptions. It may be that something that's revealed in the title commitment or the survey can be fixed by the seller. Perhaps their shed has been moved over onto an easement or something of that line, or perhaps crossed the property line onto their neighbor's property. The seller has an opportunity to fix that, and it doesn't just kill the deal. And that time period you see right here is 15 days after the seller receives the objections. And if that takes it beyond the standard closing date, then the closing date will be extended. There's another date here. If objections are not cured within the cure period, the buyer may, by delivering notice to the seller within 5 days after the end of the cure period, they have options. They can terminate the contract, or they can waive their right to object on the basis of that exception. So The HOA doesn't allow chickens. That's nothing that the seller can fix. The buyer decides they can live without chickens, so they can either give notice, I'm withdrawing my objection, or simply don't do anything, in which case it is presumed that the buyer is now okay and is proceeding. Let's look at now number 10, the objection period for revised commitment survey or new exceptions. It's quite possible that during this transaction process, the title company could discover things that were not revealed in the initial release of title commitment and survey. And if they come back and say, oh, here's something else that we missed or something that's new that's come up, the number of days that you put up here in the first blank next to my number 7, the buyer now has that additional 3 days or 5 days or whatever it is to review and object to these new circumstances. Okay, let's keep rocking and rolling here. We're making good progress. I'm scrolling down to page 4, property condition. And this is where we find number 11, the delivery period for the seller's disclosure. And I can see that your screen has not quite caught up with me. That's why you might want to have your own contract in front of you that I sent to you. I think it will catch up. It's just a little bit slow. So you may want to follow along or open up your own contract to follow along. So this is on page 4 under B2. Buyer, well, let's do B1. Buyer has received the notice. The buyer has received the seller's disclosure notice. If they haven't, then we go to B2. Buyer's not received the notice, and here's the date. Within blank days after the effective date, the seller shall deliver this notice to the buyer. Now, if you have been tuning out because this is difficult stuff and it's dates and deadlines, please tune back in. Put down the tuna fish sandwich. Don't pet the dog for just a moment. Extremely important. If the buyer does not receive the notice, the buyer may terminate this contract at any time prior to the closing, and the earnest money will be refunded to buyer. I cannot tell you the number of times this year, 2020, when agents have come to me and said, my seller is refusing to provide a seller's disclosure. And perhaps typically they think they're not required to because it was a rental property and they never lived in it. They have some excuse or circumstance, but about half the time it is not a legitimate exemption from providing the seller's disclosure. And you need to be in a position to inform your seller, if you don't provide this, first of all, you're violating the Texas property code, but second, you are giving the buyer an automatic get out of jail free card. They can cancel this contract at any time prior to closing and get their earnest money back. So it's very important for a couple reasons that the seller provide that disclosure. Now, a couple more deadlines in here. If the seller delivers the notice, the buyer may terminate the contract for any reason within 7 days after receiving the notice. So let's just say that you have a 10-day option period, which would be fairly typical, but the seller doesn't get around to providing the seller disclosure until day 5. Well, you add 7 to 5, and now that 10-day option period has turned into 12 days. What if it takes them all 10 days to provide it? Now it's a 17-day option period. So whenever possible, you want to have that seller's disclosure in hand, uploaded to the MLS, so that you can check box number 1 that the buyer has received this notice, and that way it doesn't extend the option period in any way. I've had a couple agents come to me in the last week or so and say, my buyer doesn't even want an option period because they have an inspection from a previous buyer, or they're buying it as is and they know their issues, they're an investor, that type thing. They don't want or not negotiating for an option period. If the seller does not provide this seller's disclosure at time of contract, well, guess what? Your buyer has an option period, and it's going to be 7 days. They can terminate at any point prior to receiving the seller's disclosure, and then they've got another 7 days, which is essentially an option period after that to review it. And for any reason, they can go ahead and cancel. So I hope you're getting the point here. As a listing agent, you want to get that seller's disclosure and provide it prior to going under contract, so you don't create a second option period for the buyer. Okay, let's scroll down to paragraph F. And I see it is catching up with me. That's awesome. So we're looking at number 14, the deadline for completion of repairs and treatments. Unless otherwise agreed in writing, the seller shall complete all required repairs and treatments prior to the closing date. That's what I wanted to call your attention to, because I hear all the time from agents, well, the seller is just going to provide money to the buyer to make repairs after closing. Let me just say that if you put that in your contract and it's a financed offer, it will never go through. The lender will never agree to that language. They're not going to loan money on a defective property, and you've acknowledged it's defective in the contract. So if they want to do that, then the seller simply needs to make a contribution to buyer closing costs, but do not mention that that contribution is to pay for repairs after closing. That's what would sabotage the deal. Number 15, look towards the bottom of that paragraph. If seller fails to complete any agreed repairs and treatments prior to the closing date, buyer may exercise remedies under paragraph 15, and that's the termination paragraph, the rights upon default of the other party, or extend the closing date up to 5 days if necessary for seller to complete the repairs or treatments. So think about this. When does this come into play? And I'm glad you all are listening. We're 101 online right now. I promise you this is going to come up in your career. You are representing the buyer. You're doing your final walkthrough perhaps an hour before the scheduled closing, and you see that repairs have not been made, that something was left undone. Your buyer has a contractual right here to bump out the closing date for up to 5 more days and tell that seller, get in there and finish those repairs. Sometimes the seller will say, oh, we're going to do it. We'll be back tomorrow. Don't close. Postpone the closing date. Make sure everything is done, and then you can close. Now, what if the repairs never get made? Paragraph 15, again, gives the buyer options. They can terminate the contract and get their money back, or they can sue for specific performance and make the seller complete the treatments and then sell them the home. So very, very important, particularly if you are the buyer's agent trying to protect your buyer. Let's go to number 16. We're down in paragraph number 9, the closing date. The closing of the sale will be on or before blank date or within 7 days after objections have been made under paragraph D have been cured or waived. Those were the title or survey objections. We have seen one time in the contract already, and I apologize that I didn't point it out. We're going to see it one more time, and I will point it out. This little statement after a deadline is given that says, time is of the essence. It does not say that right here, and I want you all to be keenly aware of the implications of that statement. First of all, it says, look in the last sentence of this first A paragraph, if either party fails to close the sale by the closing date, the non-defaulting party may exercise the remedies contained in paragraph 15, meaning that if you don't close, you are in breach of the contract, and the other party may exercise their remedies to terminate and get the earnest money back or to sue for specific performance. But because this does not say time is of the essence, it is a lower threshold breach than failure to deliver the earnest money or failure to deliver the option fee. And let me share with you where this comes in. And this is very relevant to what's going on in our market right now. The COVID-19 has created all kinds of issues where title companies and survey companies and lenders, it's harder to hit closing dates because not everybody's working, not everybody has access to documents. And let's just say everybody in good faith has been moving towards the closing date, but then there's some delay on the lender's part in delivering the loan. The seller may think, well, the buyer's in default, they couldn't hit the closing date, then I can go to paragraph 15 and terminate this contract. Well, by the literal terms of the contract, yes. But if the buyer objects, I can promise you a judge is going to keep this contract in place. The closing date is not, quote, time is of the essence. It is a target date. It's a good faith date. But if for any legitimate reason, buyer or seller are not able to meet that date, the courts have consistently held that the other party needs to show flexibility and grant additional time in order for that to happen. Again, that presumes that it's for a reason outside the control of the buyer or seller. Paragraph 10, number 17, the possession date. Seller shall deliver to buyer possession of the property in its present or required condition, ordinary wear and tear accepted, 1, upon closing and funding, or 2, according to a temporary residential lease form promulgated by TREC. So the typical scenario is at closing, we hand over the keys, the buyer walks out, they now have possession of that home. But sometimes the buyer wants to move in early prior to closing, or sometimes the seller wants to stay in the house after closing. And sometimes this just might be for a day. So they can get the moving truck there and get all their stuff out, but it's not going to happen until after closing. If either of those scenarios happens, the buyer moves in early or the seller stays late, you must have either one of these promulgated TREC forms recognizing the possession by the non-owning property. If you don't do that, this paragraph 17 says you have established a tenancy at sufferance between the parties. Now, I'm not an attorney, and Michael could explain this a lot better, but a tenancy at sufferance is essentially an acknowledgement that the person habitating the property is doing so without the permission of the owner. That's typically called a tenancy. A tenancy at will is when there's no written documentation reflecting the terms of the lease. A tenancy at sufferance is typically when a tenant who has a legitimate lease stays over. When the lease is over, they don't move out, they stay. And there's all kinds of legal implications of that. Beyond that, insurance companies typically are not going to cover any damages. If the buyer moves in early and there's a fire and the buyer loses their possessions, those aren't the possessions of the owner of the property, they're somebody else. Or if the seller stays over, they no longer own that home. The buyer's insurance company is providing the insurance, and if there's a fire or casualty loss, they're not going to compensate that seller for being in a property they don't even own. All kinds of implications. So if you have a buyer moving in early or a seller staying late, make sure that you use a TREC form or an actual lease agreement to document the terms of that occupancy. Number 18, very important. If there is a tenant living in that property upon closing, what this says is, if the property is subject to any lease in which the seller is a party, the seller shall deliver to the buyer copies of the lease and any move-in condition form signed by the tenant within 7 days after the effective date of the contract. Now, if you're buying a home that's got a tenant in it, you want to be seeing these lease terms and the move-in condition form long before you go under contract. But the deadline, if you've not received it by that point, is 7 days after the effective date. And by the way, it doesn't say it in this paragraph, it does say it elsewhere in the contract, that the security deposits held by the seller are to be transferred to the buyer so that the tenant can go directly to the buyer to receive the return of their security deposit upon move out. Let's go to paragraph 12, and let me pause just for a moment and say, I am not looking at the chat window. And the reason for that is when I've done that earlier in this recording, it has totally messed up the slides. For some reason, it's got a bad technological glitch there. So I'm going to get through this teaching portion and then I'm going to open the chat. So feel free to go ahead and ask your questions, pose your questions, and I will get to them. I just don't want to mess up our screenshot doing that in the middle. Here we go. Paragraph 12, we're going to look at deadline number 19. The following expenses must be paid at or prior to closing. This is not typically a big deal in our contracts. It identifies the seller's closing expenses in 1, the buyer's closing expenses down in paragraph 2. But what I do want to point out here to you is that buyers and sellers will often ask you, what kind of expenses am I going to have at closing? And I've heard many agents say, well, maybe we can ask the title company, or you'll be informed of those expenses prior to closing by the lender. They're actually identified right here. And you can just open up to page 5 and page 6 of the contract and show your buyer or seller client exactly what fees they're going to be responsible for by the terms of the contract. And of course, all of that's negotiable, but if there aren't changes, this is what each party is going to be expected to pay. Let's go down to paragraph 13 and see deadline number 20, which is the adjustment period for tax prorations. Again, I'm going to ask you to pay very close attention for just a moment, because I'll bet you there's not one agent out of 10 who knows about this paragraph in the contract. And this is going to be your service advantage to your clients, that you understand this. And I'm going to read the whole thing because it's so important. Paragraph 13. Taxes for the current year, interest, maintenance fees, assessments, dues and rents will be prorated through the closing date. And you always see that on the settlement statement. The tax proration may be calculated taking into consideration any change in exemptions that will affect the current year's taxes. So perhaps the seller has a senior citizen exemption, a disabled veteran exemption, and the buyer is not going to have access to that. Well, the title company can adjust for that at closing. Here's the most important part. The parties shall adjust the prorations when tax statements for the current year are available. Well, let's say the closing is this month. It's in April of 2020. The tax bill doesn't come out until the fall, typically October. Well, what happens if tax rates go up or down? Or there are other issues that affect maintenance fees and assessments and that type thing. What it says here is that the tax portion will be adjusted. So 6 months after closing, the buyer or the seller could go back to the other party and require, by the terms of this contract, that they make an adjustment. Perhaps the buyer owes the seller money, or the seller owes the buyer. They are expected to cooperate in that process. So see, you're smarter already. I see the intelligence meter binging at the top. Paragraph 14, casualty loss. We are at number 21, the deadline for restoring the property. So let's say that you go under contract, you're 6 weeks from closing, and there's a fire or a flood or something else that damages the property. What happens? Is the contract automatically void? Not at all. What it says here is that if any part of the property is damaged or destroyed by fire or other casualty after the effective date of the contract, but before closing, seller shall restore the property to its previous condition as soon as reasonably possible, but in any event, by the closing date. So even if it was damaged, seller, you're going to fix it and have it ready and close as planned. If seller fails to do so due to factors beyond the seller's control, the buyer may terminate the contract and get the earnest money back, or buyer may extend the time for performance up to 15 days. So again, if the seller says, hey, it was a bad fire, I can't get it ready by the closing date, the buyer can say either, okay, well then terminate and give me my money back, or the buyer can say, well, take another 15 days. I still want to purchase the property, get it ready, and I will still purchase it. So hopefully this deal is still going to stay together. Let's scroll down the page and go to date deadline number 23. We're at the top of page 7, and the item is the deadline to object to a demand by the other party for the earnest money. Why is it that everybody's fighting over the earnest money these days? It seems like I'm hearing about it more and more and more. So let me pull down the page just a little bit. I'm going to look at paragraph C, the very beginning. Upon termination of this contract, either party or the escrow agent may send a release of earnest money to each party, and the party shall execute counterparts of the release and deliver same to the escrow agent. So everybody's signing the earnest money release that releases all parties from all obligations under the contract. It effectively terminates the contract, and it identifies in that release who's going to get the earnest money. But do the buyer and seller always agree on that? What if it's very clear in the contract that the buyer is entitled to the earnest money deposit? Maybe the house burned down and the seller can't get it ready for the closing date. The title company is not going to release those funds to the buyer without written permission. We still require both the buyer and the seller to sign for the earnest money to release. However, let's keep reading. If either party fails to execute the release, either party may make a written demand to the escrow agent for the earnest money. So the buyer could send a letter to the title company and say, hey, this seller is just a goofball. They refuse to sign the earnest money release. I'm insisting that you release it back to me. If only one party makes a written demand for the earnest money, the escrow agent shall promptly provide a copy of demand to the other party. If the escrow agent does not receive a written objection from the other party within 15 days, they will disperse the money to the demanding party. So if the seller doesn't say, hey, I want that money, the title company will release it to the buyer who made the demand, less any expenses that are owed. Okay, so that's one way a dispute can be resolved, is for one party to make a demand, and if the other party doesn't respond, it'll be released. Now look with me at paragraph D. Any party who wrongfully fails or refuses to sign a release, the earnest money release, acceptable to the escrow agent within 7 days of receipt of the request, will be liable to the other party for 1, damages, 2, the earnest money, 3, reasonable attorney fees, and 4, all costs of suit. In other words, let's just say, back to use my example, the seller's house burned down. By contract, the buyer is entitled to return of the earnest money if it can't be rebuilt and put in condition by the closing date, but the seller still refuses to sign the release. Well, what this says here, the seller here who is refusing to sign a contractual release, they're refusing to abide by this contract, they then are liable not just for the release of the earnest money, but for damages. The buyer can say, hey, your refusal to release my earnest money kept me from buying the house I wanted over here, or caused me to get kicked out of my apartment because I couldn't pay the rent. Damages, earnest money, reasonable attorney's fees, and all costs of the suit. So When buyers or sellers play hardball with the earnest money, you need to call their attention to this paragraph. And if they rightfully should sign the release, you need to tell them, please read this paragraph. If you do not understand it, then you need to get legal advice. Because as I read it, you could be creating some liability for yourself. Okay? Strike that last sentence from the record. That was legal advice, but you understand. You can put it in better words. That's not giving advice, but just have them read it. And if they don't understand it, have them contact an attorney. Very, very important. This paragraph will save a whole bunch of you a whole bunch of grief if you'll just remember it and then can draw it to the attention of your stubborn client. Once they read that, they'll be like, all right, give me that form, and they'll sign it and move on. Number 25, paragraph 19, representations. Again, very interesting fact. Very few people know this. All covenants, representations, and warranties in the contract survive the closing. And most of these representations and warranties are made by the seller. So if any representation of seller in the contract is untrue at the closing date, maybe I don't have clear title to provide to you. Maybe I lied on the seller's disclosure and it was something that couldn't have been discovered in a normal inspection process. The seller will be in default. Unless expressly prohibited by written agreement, seller may continue to show the property and receive, negotiate, and accept backup offers. That's a whole separate issue, but sometimes you'll see buyers upset that the property is continued to be shown after it's under contract, but the actual contract gives that right to the seller. That's a rabbit trail, but that was a good one for some of y'all. Okay, scrolling down the page, let's come to paragraph 23 and number 26 and 27, dates and deadlines. This is all in relationship to the option fee. So let's read it. For nominal consideration, the receipt of which is hereby acknowledged by seller, and buyer's agreement to pay seller blank number of dollars, the option fee, within 3 days after the effective date of this contract, seller grants buyer the unrestricted right to terminate. So the first date I want to call your attention to is the delivery date of the option fee, 3 days after the effective date. So if the effective date's on a Tuesday, then you've got Wednesday, Thursday, Friday at 5 p.m. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. You have those full 3 days in order to pay the option money. And I want to pause here because I see so many buyers and then by extension agents and brokers getting in trouble because the buyer wants to put the option money in the mail, or perhaps they're going to overnight it, or perhaps the agent says to the buyer, or the buyer wants to deliver it themselves and the agent agrees to that, I'll take it by the listing broker's office, or I'll take it by the seller's home and drop it off. The problem with that, agents, is that buyers don't understand paragraph 23 and the urgency of meeting this deadline. And they may have every good intention of delivering by day 3, but they got a lot going on in their world and they don't do it till day 4 or day 5 thinking, well, it's okay. It's just like paying your utility bill. They're not going to cut you off if you're a day or 2 late. But look at the last sentence in this paragraph in bold. Here's where the second time it shows up in our contract. Time is of the essence for this paragraph, and strict compliance with the time for performance is required. That means if the buyer breaches this, then there's really no remedy for them. If the option money is not delivered by day 3, there is no option period. And agents, you do not want to find yourself in this position. Best practice, you collect the option fee and the earnest money checks at time of contract. When you're writing the offer, go ahead and collect the checks, because so often our buyers are going to be writing the offer and then getting on a plane and going back to Pittsburgh, or they're going on vacation, or for some reason they're otherwise unavailable, and you find yourself in a panic trying to meet this deadline, and sometimes you physically can't. It's actually impossible to do so. So best practice, collect these checks at time of offer. And then when the offer, you can submit copies of the checks with your offer to show that your buyer is serious. And then once it is executed, fully executed, then you have those checks in your possession and you can control delivery. Number 27 deals with the actual option period. That's that second blank where you fill in the number of days after the effective date that the option period will be in effect. Now, here's the paragraph I got ahead of myself earlier. Notices under this paragraph must be given by 5 p.m. local time where the property is located by the date specified. So delivery of the option money is not a notice. You've got until midnight on day 3 for delivery. But the notice of buyer termination under the contract is only available till 5 p.m. on the last day of the option period. And by the way, that's good news. And that change only came into effect a year or two ago. And so you would literally, as an agent, be negotiating repairs under the option period up until midnight on the last day. And now it's 5 p.m. So I think that was done for the benefit of agents, and for that we are very grateful. Let me pause because I'm moving quicker than I expected to be. So I'm going to chase one other rabbit, but it's a juicy one, and I think you'll be very glad that we did. Agents get themselves in big trouble. I hear this all the time when they're representing a buyer and say it's the last day of the option period, and they've even submitted perhaps their repair request to the listing agent, but the listing agent keeps coming back and saying, well, I can't get a hold of the sellers. They're on a cruise, they're on vacation, they're in a place where they don't have good internet access, we don't have a good phone connection, but I'm pretty sure this all is going to look good to them. It's in line with what they've told me previously. And then all of a sudden it's 3 o'clock and you don't have a response. It's 4 o'clock and you don't have a response. If it gets to 5 o'clock, your option period has expired, and that seller now, the buyer has no leverage to force the seller or encourage the seller to sign that repair amendment. So don't ever let that happen to yourself. The way you get around it is that when you write the repair amendment, asking for a seller contribution or certain repairs to be made, at the same time, you have the buyer sign a notice of termination and earnest money release. Let that sink in. That might be the most important thing you hear today. At the same time, have them sign that notice of termination and earnest money release. Then, if that listing agent is not getting back with you at 4:50 p.m. local time, you send that notice of termination to the listing agent. It preserves the right of your buyer to withdraw from the contract. It is a withdrawal from the contract, but keep in mind it can be torn up. If the seller wants to keep the deal in place and they want to agree to the buyer's concessions, there's nothing preventing that deal from going back under contract under the same terms. You could even just tear up the notice with all parties' agreement and continue on towards closing. But without that notice of termination, now the seller has no urgency, or the buyer has no leverage to urge them to sign. So please do that for your benefit and that of your buyers. Get it signed at time of amendment. Number 28, and the last critical date in the 1 to 4 family contract, perhaps the most important of all, and that is the effective date. Executed the blank day of the blank month of 2020, broker fill in the date of final acceptance. This effective date is typically filled in by the listing agent because their client is the last person to sign. The buyers have signed and sent over the offer. Once the seller signs, the listing agent fills in this date, it is now effective. All parties have signed, and you immediately send a copy of this executed effective date completed contract back to the buyer's broker. Now it's effective. All parties have signed. All parties have been notified that all parties have signed. You have a fully effective contract. Now, what happens, buyer's agents, when the contract comes back to you signed by the sellers, but the listing agent did not fill in the effective date? You fill it out. It doesn't have to be the listing agent. It could be any agent a party to this contract, and you fill in the date that all parties had signed and all parties had been notified. So if this happened on a Tuesday, but you don't actually get a copy till Thursday, and you see that it was left out, then you go back and date it as of Tuesday, because that was the effective date. Almost all the critical deadlines in this document and addendums spring off the effective date. So make sure it is always filled in, even if you have to do the job of the listing agent. Okay, so just 3 more to go, and we're going to scroll down to the third party financing addendum for these last 3 dates, and then I'll open the chat and respond to any of your questions. So here we go. We're on the third party financing addendum, paragraph A. And what I want to point out to you here is the period of time for applying for financing. The paragraph says type of financing and duty to apply and obtain approval. Buyer shall apply promptly. That's the time period. We are working under a deadline here, and in good faith, the buyer needs to move quickly to apply and provide all information and documents provided by the lender. By definition of the language here, if the buyer drags their feet, they're in default of the contract. They're probably not going to hit their financing date, and they could possibly lose their earnest money. So apply promptly. By the way, one other fat, juicy rabbit, and we'll move quickly to 30 and 31. Many agents think that you can only check one type of financing box. In other words, this has to be a conventional loan or a VETS loan or an FHA or a VA. That is not the case. Look at the language here. Buyer shall apply promptly for all financing described below. And that means if your buyer wants to keep their options open, perhaps they're a veteran and they're applying for VA, but they would really prefer to have a conventional loan because the fees are so much lower, but they're not sure they're going to qualify for conventional, they can check both conventional and VA. That is perfectly acceptable, and I even recommend it when your buyer's in a situation like what I just described. Let's scroll down now to 30 and 31. Prepare yourself, many of you agents, for an aha moment. I had this question as recently as yesterday, and we're going to clear this up for everybody. There are 2 approvals on the third-party financing addendum that are required. The first one is for the buyer approval. Look at B1. This contract is subject to buyer obtaining buyer approval. If buyer cannot obtain buyer approval, buyer may give written notice to seller within blank days after the effective date of the contract. And then the contract will terminate, the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. This is the approval that everybody knows about. And we're typically going to put in 15, 20, 21 days, 25 days at the outset. We got a pre-approved buyer and a hustling lender. You can do the lower end of the time period and make your offer more attractive to the seller. If the buyer doesn't get financing and they terminate within those required days, they get their earnest money back. Now, agents, it's not so much the buyer's responsibility, even though it says it contractually here. The buyer is not the professional in this relationship. You are. So you are the one responsible for managing this date. And if you see that your buyer's not going to have final approval within this time period, you need to get a notice of termination submitted or an amendment extending the time for approval. Because if it says 21 days and you go to day 22 and then the lender says, I'm sorry, this is not going to work, your buyer has lost their earnest money. And in my opinion, that's on you, because you should have taken control of the situation and either gotten a notice of termination or an amendment to extend. Now, most of you all are aware of that, but very few agents seemingly are aware of paragraph 2. The buyer has to be approved, but the property also. Let's read this. Property approval will be deemed to have been obtained when the property has satisfied lender's underwriting requirements for the loan, including, but not limited to, appraisal, insurability, and lender required repairs. If property approval is not obtained, buyer may terminate this contract by giving notice to seller before closing, and the earnest money will be refunded to buyer. You will note there is no time period like 21 days on property approval. Right up to the point of closing, if it's not insurable, if it didn't meet appraisal requirements, if the lender's requiring repairs that the seller doesn't want to make, the buyer can terminate the contract. No deadline. Now, one of the things, this is one of the biggest contract mistakes I see, and it's an absolute violation of the contract, is agents who write in special provisions, offer subject to appraisal. And it states right there in the special provisions instructions that you are not to include any terms in special provisions that are covered elsewhere in the contract or related addendums. This says right here it's subject to appraisal. So you don't need to write that in special provisions. Please stop that. I see it way too often and it makes my remaining hairs curl up, okay? Insurability. Let's say that the roof is 20 years old and the insurance company is not going to insure it. Well, that gives the buyer the right to cancel the contract right up until the day of closing. So personal approval for the buyer and then property approval both have to be met. One has a stated time period, one does not. So hopefully you have found that helpful. That's all 31 dates in the 1 to 4 and the third party. Now I'm going to open up the chat and see if there are some questions in here that we need to address. And you think I'm funny, please tell Lisa. She says I don't have a sense of humor. Let's see. Notice to terminate or extend the contract. Try to extend the contract anytime you think there might be a delay. That is great advice. Michael says, and the 1 to 4 is uploaded. We're also starting the entire course over, starting tomorrow with the IBS. Thank you, Michael. He did wrap up our contract mastery series covering the entire library, and he is about to start over. Best practice is for the listing agent to put a date in the blank provided for effective date. The parties sign on different dates, and then there can be an argument over which timestamp should apply. You know what I like to do, and I didn't mention this. When I'm the listing agent, I've received it from the buyer, they've already executed it. I'm now sending it to my sellers for electronic signature. I will put the date stamp in the effective date paragraph so that when they sign the contract, the date will automatically be inserted. And presuming that if there are more than one seller, they all sign on the same date, then you have that automatically put in there, and it is the correct date. All righty, let's see here. When the contract is signed with e-signature that was date stamped, can that take the position of number? Oh, Mike, you must have been reading my mind. Okay, well done. Buying agent, listing agent. Lisa, looks like you've been doing all the heavy lifting here, answering the questions. That is excellent. Okay, Linda remembers the bad old days of negotiating till midnight. All right. Option periods are always recommended, and you will often hear your sellers, your buyers say, oh, but I don't really care. I'm going to buy it no matter what. Have them put something in there. And let me also make this point. I'm glad somebody asked this question, or at least a related question. If you are going to use an amendment to extend the option period, say that you had a regular inspection, it showed the need for a specialty inspection like a roof inspection or HVAC inspection. You can't get all that done within the 7 or 10 days you had originally allocated for. You can do an amendment extending the option period, but it absolutely must include an additional option fee. If you don't put an additional option fee in there, then it is invalid. And there is no additional option period, even if all people sign it. So you may have put $100 or $1,000 on the original contract. It doesn't matter. There must be an additional option fee anytime the option period is extended. Okay. Okay, y'all were voting on title company. Let's see what this says. What was the original question? Would the buyer go to the seller for incorrect tax or the title company? Looks like y'all are voting for title company. When you say the title company, that's presuming that you think the title company made a mistake, and that is not what the contract is envisioning here. What they're saying is if there's some change in either in a tax assessment or the removal of an exemption that wasn't anticipated at the time of closing, something changes, and it's typically the tax rate or the assessed value of the home that's going to change the tax bill. These are issues that were unknown at time of closing. It wasn't that the title company made a mistake. It's that at closing, we're guessing what the final tax bill is going to be. We don't know exactly because we don't have the assessment. The rates may change. And if there is a change, the buyer and seller agree to go to each other and work that out. This is not talking about a title company mistake. Should a buyer ever be allowed to move in early? There are some circumstances where a buyer should move in early or a seller should stay late, but I mean they should be exceedingly rare because there are just so many things that can go wrong when that happens. And what I typically see it is when the buyer stays in after closing. I'm sorry, the seller stays in after closing. The buyer may go and do a final walk before the closing, but the seller's still there. They haven't moved out. So at closing, you sign this buyer walk through an acceptance form, but the seller stays in the home 3 more days before they move out, and they just tear the place apart upon move out, banging into walls. Perhaps they stripped out a couple light fixtures on their way out, took all the toilet paper, God forbid. And now the seller leaseback agreement does provide for a security deposit and the terms that, you know, the seller is to, or now the tenant is to leave the condition of the home in when they leave. But what I see most of the time is on these seller leaseback agreements, the buyer's agent has not negotiated a significant enough security deposit to cover damages. So don't just think that that extra seller leaseback form is, you can put $100 in there, or, well, we all like each other, everybody's getting along, this is no big deal. Put a significant security deposit in there so that if the seller damages it upon move out, there is some recourse. Okie dokies. Let's see. What do you do when you receive a seller's disclosure that has lines through the seller's disclosure with nothing written on it, claiming they never lived in it? So, Mike, I did a video recently, you can find it on our YouTube channel, about the specific exemptions from providing the seller's disclosure, and in which case there'd be no disclosure at all. In this case, where you get a seller's disclosure where the seller is providing it, but they simply don't know the answer, that is legitimate. Many times they won't know the answer. Perhaps they haven't lived there. They don't have firsthand knowledge. Perhaps they live out of town. They've never even seen the property. The seller disclosure is a requirement for them to disclose all known facts. But if they don't know, it's an honest answer to say, we don't know. All right, let me just check a few more here.
Hey, all the way at the bottom, there's a lot of new questions that I didn't answer if you want to check those out.
Okay, let's see here. If the seller is an attorney selling a foreclosure or short sale, how do you work it out? I'm not quite sure what the question there is. What do you work out? Angela, if you could just clarify what you mean by that question. Let's see here. Additional option fee collected anytime. Yes, that's exactly right. Glad you were here. I'm not seeing any other new questions. Here we go, Robin. If effective date is backdated to the date last person signed and is now second day, does that mean that you only have 1 day to get the EMOPF, earnest money option? Yes, it does. Because that was the effective date. Just because the effective date wasn't filled in on the contract doesn't mean that the effective date is somehow delayed. No, that is the effective date. And we're just going back now, and by filling it in 2 days later, we're acknowledging what is. We're acknowledging reality. By that, we're not making that the effective date. We're simply acknowledging, no, that's when it was effective, and we're putting that date in there, okay? So yes, that hasn't, the failure to fill in the effective date on the contract does not extend the delivery period for the option fee and earnest money. Perhaps that's a better way to say it. Now, what could happen is that now there's an argument between the buyer and the seller about when the effective date truly was. That's why you want to do it contemporaneous with it becoming effective. But no, failure to fill it in does not extend the time periods. Bob says, notice the survey and T47 are required to be delivered both the title company and the seller. Otherwise, the seller may have to pay for a new survey. Bob always reads these things. When I get my book ready to go to print, I'm going to send it to Bob first and have him read everything. So Stas, you already have the file with the 31 highlights. I emailed it out to you last night, and I have also uploaded it to Backagent. It includes the list of 31, and it includes my markups on the page. But thank you for asking. That makes me feel like you value it. In paragraph 6C1, can you check both boxes and have the buyer split payment of the survey? Yes, I've actually seen that done. Sometimes it confuses the title company, but when you tell them, well, we're splitting it, they understand and they go ahead and split it. Okay. Okay, thank you, Rena. Appreciate the good feedback. Robin says, what about new construction? I may have missed the context of that question, Robin. If you want to type in exactly what you were talking about. I'm going all the way to the bottom. Stephanie, if seller leased back the home, can the buyer walkthrough be done later? No, Stephanie, that buyer walkthrough is specifically for closing. However, in any lease, there's a move-in condition report and a move-out condition. And so the buyer's accepting the property when they purchase it, but that doesn't mean it can't be damaged after purchase by the holdover seller. So it would not be the same form. Okay. If the seller delays inspections due to utilities not being on, does the additional earnest money still apply? So I think what you mean by that is additional option money. If the option period must be extended, is an additional option money deposit required? Yes. If you don't make an additional deposit, there is no additional option period. Now, the contract states that the seller will cause the utilities to be turned on as of the effective date of the contract and remain on until closing for this very reason. So you could make a case that the seller is in default of the contract, in which case you would go to paragraph 15. But one of the paragraph 15 remedies is not a free extension of the option period. Okay, so don't get those issues tangled up with each other when they are entirely separate. Okay. All right. How long do you extend if financing period is not met in 21 days? Carla, that would be a question for the lender. How much more time do you need? Now, keep in mind, it's going to be negotiable. The seller doesn't have to agree to this, to an extension of time. But if you can go back and say the seller says they just need 4 more days or 5 more days, typically the seller will agree to that, particularly if that does not extend the closing date. Okay. I believe that Angela M is talking about the final walkthrough when the seller is HUD, right, Angela? Let's see. So there's still going to be a final walkthrough, even if HUD is the seller. The buyer still has to accept the home in its condition. And I think what you mean by that is HUD doesn't make any representations about the condition of the home, and you're buying it in as-is condition. But what if the night before closing, there's a water leak and the home floods? Is the buyer required to close on that home? Absolutely not. The contract says that you're purchasing the home in its current condition, wear and tear accepted. But a casualty loss is not normal wear and tear. And so even if it's a HUD home, or you're buying from an investor and you check the box as is on the contract, that does not mean that you have to buy the property if something beyond wear and tear has devalued its condition. Okay. Let's see here. All right, Raphael, I appreciate your kind remarks. I think we got everything cleared up. If I missed something, feel free to reach out to me. I am hanging out at the office. Don't worry about me. I'm alone. Every once in a while, somebody will come in, but we appropriately social distance. And most days I don't see anybody. So appreciate y'all being on here. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording and close the class. Be sure to join us tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock for KV Core and 10 o'clock for Reboot on Michael Hughes with Contract Mastery. Love you guys. Take care. Let me know anything I can do for you.